Welcome. You're here because you want to get your head around something complex, understand it properly, without wading through tons of text.
Yeah, cut straight to the core.
Exactly. You've given us the sources, and today we're really diving into a big one. That recent UK Supreme Court ruling defining woman based on biological sex.
hmm It's definitely made waves.
So we're going to unpack what the court actually said, why it's causing such a stir, and how it connects to, well, everything else going on culturally.
And we're using Louise Perry's analysis from John Anderson Media as our main guide here, right? We've got the transcript.
That's the plan, the mission today. Get to the heart of this ruling, understand the arguments swirling around it, and see the bigger picture. Okay, so this ruling, what's the headline?
Well, the headline is that the UK's highest court, the Supreme Court, unanimously decided that when the Equality Act uses the word woman, it refers to biological sex.
Not sort of a socially constructed idea or just self-identification.
Exactly. It's rooted in biology, according to this ruling. And Louise Perry really emphasizes this isn't just some minor point. Coming from the top court, it sets a really strong legal precedent for future cases.
Okay, and Perry frames this as a significant win, doesn't she, for a specific group?
Yeah, she calls it a political and social victory for what's known as the gender-critical feminist movement.
Right. And her point is that this didn't just happen, it's the result of years of effort.
Oh, absolutely. She highlights the persistence of people in that movement, how they kept advocating for this specific understanding of sex, often, facing pretty serious personal and professional consequences.
So for them, this ruling feels like a kind of validation after a tough fight.
That's the sense you get from her analysis, yeah.
Mm.
For listeners maybe less familiar, the gender-critical viewpoint generally stresses the importance of biological sex as a category, especially regarding women's rights and protections.
Got it. Now, Perry also talks about how public opinion has shifted on these issues. What's her take there?
It's interesting. She suggests that initially, maybe 5, 10 years ago, there was more public openness towards transgenderism. It was often framed as just being kind, being decent to people who were different.
A bit like the shift in attitudes towards homosexuality, perhaps?
She draws that parallel, yeah.
Yeah.
Sort of live and let live, be accepting.
But she thinks that's changed, that the mood is different now.
Yes. She argues that public opinion has hardened quite a bit over time.
And why does she think that happened?
She attributes it to what she perceives as increasingly extreme demands coming from some trans activists.
Okay, like what specifically? Does she give examples?
She does. Things like the assertion that a woman is anyone who says they're a woman, flat out. Also, the ongoing, often heated debates about female-only spaces, prison shelters, bathrooms, sports.
Ah, the sports issue. That's been very visible.
Very. The sight of biological males competing, and sometimes dominating, in women's categories. Perry sees that as a key factor in shifting public views.
So the core idea is that the movement, or at least parts of it, maybe push things too far for the average person.
That's essentially her argument. She uses the phrase, ask too much of the public. Specifically, asking people to, in her words, deny the truth of their own eyes and ears, that biological differences are real and observable.
That requiring that sort of cognitive dissonance was maybe a step too far.
That seems to be her point, yes, that it created a barrier for broader acceptance.
Now, what about the political reaction? You mentioned the UK Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. He welcomed the ruling, said it brought clarity.
He did, yes, which Perry finds. Well, interesting.
Interesting because wasn't he on record before saying things that seemed to contradict this definition? Like the comment about whether only women have a cervix was wrong?
Precisely. Perry points out that apparent inconsistency, so you're left wondering, is this a genuine change of heart based on the ruling, or is it maybe reflecting where the political winds and public opinion are now blowing?
And Perry seems quite concerned about politicians potentially getting swayed by ideology over, well, biology.
Yeah, she uses the term hoodwinked. She expresses concern that political elites might have been persuaded by a movement to deny what she sees as basic biological distinctions.
And that it's worrying if they only seem to correct course when public mood shifts.
Right. It raises that bigger question she poses. If they're wrong about this, what else are they wrong about?
That's a powerful question. It challenges trust, doesn't it? If you think they're out of step on something so fundamental.
It definitely implies broader concerns about judgment and connection to reality.
This leads her into discussing the ideology behind some of these shifts. She prefers the term progressive over woke.
Yes, she finds progressive more useful. partly because it's often how proponents self-identify, and she thinks it better describes the core beliefs.
Okay, so what does she identify as the key tenets of this progressive ideology?
She breaks it down into a few core ideas. First, this very linear view of history, the belief that things are always getting better, progressing forward.
Which sounds good, but what's the downside she sees?
It can lead to what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery, basically dismissing anything from the past as inherently bad or stupid just because it's old, kind of arrogance towards history,
Right, losing potentially valuable wisdom. What's the second tenet?
a belief in the sort of fundamental interchangeability of humans, downplaying or denying significant innate differences between men and women.
Like the blank slate idea, that we're all born the same and culture writes everything.
Exactly. She connects it to Steven Pinker's work on the blank slate. This view minimizes biology, minimizes inherent predispositions,
And third,
a rejection of innate differences in personality or typical preferences between groups. Perry herself has written about average differences between males and females, so she sees ignoring these as a major flaw.
why a flaw? What are the consequences?
She argues it leads to bad policy. If you design policies assuming men and women are essentially identical in their needs, desires, and behaviors, you might get unintended negative outcomes because, on average, they aren't identical in all respects.
So, these premises, chronological snobbery, the blank slate, interchangeability, she sees them as flawed.
Deeply flawed, yes. And she argues that because the premises are wrong, the ideology built on them is proving unsuccessful, maybe even harmful.
Unsuccessful how? What evidence does she point to?
She suggests the current levels of societal division, the breakdown in trust, are signs that this progressive project has, in her words, failed.
And she thinks the political divide isn't really left versus right anymore.
Not primarily. She sees it shifting towards a split between this progressive ideology, which she characterizes as more emotion-driven, and an approach that values clear thinking, evidence, and a strong sense of history.
That's a significant reframing. She even uses quite strong language, mentioning a friend calling the trans phenomenon a sign of civilizational decline.
Yes, as a stark comparison, viewing it as a symptom of something deeper, a kind of societal madness, as she puts it.
But she qualifies that, right? Suggesting maybe people didn't fully believe it.
Yeah, she speculates that many who went along with certain claims didn't genuinely buy into the core tenets. Their motivation might have been more about wanting to be kind, compassionate, particularly towards a group perceived as vulnerable.
Which adds another layer. She also brings in the perspective of some trans people themselves.
She does. She mentions hearing from some trans individuals about this feeling of structural dependence on the generosity of strangers.
What does that mean exactly?
It refers to the difficulty, for some, of consistently passing as their identified gender, and the constant reliance on others choosing to affirm their identity to avoid, psychological distress from misgendering. It acknowledges a real vulnerability there.
But then she pivots to concerns about medical interventions.
Yes, and she uses a very strong analogy here, comparing the current approach to gender transition treatments, especially for young people, to the historical lobotomy scandal.
Wow, that's a heavy comparison. What's the parallel she's drawing?
Potential for serious harm, the spread of what she sees as misinformation, and crucially, the silencing or suppression of doctors or experts who raise concerns or dissent.
She feels dissenting voices aren't being heard.
That's her claim. She even cites a specific case, an autistic teenager apparently prosecuted for asking about someone's gender as an example of what she considers dangerous overreach.
So back to the ruling. The court defined woman biologically, but it also said trans people are protected from discrimination.
Yes, the court was clear on that. Protection in their acquired gender. But Perry immediately points out the tension there.
The practical difficulty of balancing those two things.
Exactly, especially with things like prisons, changing rooms, rape crisis center spaces traditionally segregated by sex for reasons of female safety and dignity. How do you apply both principles simultaneously in those contexts?
It creates a direct conflict in some situations.
It does, which leads to the idea of third spaces.
Like gender-neutral bathrooms or maybe separate wings in prisons.
Right, proposed as a potential compromise. Protect vulnerable women, protect trans individuals, but maybe separately.
But that's not universally accepted.
No. Perry notes that some trans activists resist this because it doesn't provide that full affirmation of being, say, a woman in the women's space. It acknowledges a difference. So finding a solution everyone agrees on is, well, difficult.
It really highlights the depth of the disagreement. Perry then connects this to a broader historical shift, talking about desionization.
Yeah, it's a term relating to the decline of Christian influence. She compares the social upheavals of the 1960s to a kind of second Reformation.
Not just reforming Christianity, but rejecting it more fundamentally.
That's her perspective. She slightly disagrees with Tom Holland on whether progressivism is itself a Christian heresy, but agrees that moving away from Christian norms has had huge consequences. Desanitization meaning that broader societal move away from Christian frameworks.
And what consequences does she see?
Well, she argues humans kind of need religion, or at least the structures and meaning it provides. When that fades, political ideologies can rush in to fill the void, often taking on a religious intensity.
Leading to more conflict and maybe even psychological issues.
She suggests a link to increased social fragmentation, loneliness, mental illness, and she argues that rejecting ancestral wisdom, which is often tied to religious traditions, makes societies more susceptible to embracing what she considers insane ideas.
Including some aspects of the trans debate, in her view.
That seems to be the implication, yes.
Does she see other drivers? Like technology?
She touches on that, yeah, suggesting things like the contraceptive pill might have had profound, maybe underestimated effects on ideology by changing fundamental aspects of life and relationships.
And she brings in Churchill.
Yeah, his observation about knowing history, that people who don't know their past are easily persuaded, lack purpose, and become vulnerable to manipulation.
Which ties back to the idea that rejecting traditional faith doesn't lead to believing nothing.
But believing in anything, that's the sentiment she echoes.
It's interesting she notes this particular progressive ideology seems very strong in Britain and its diaspora, the US, Canada, Australia, the Anglosphere.
She finds that noteworthy, too. This paradox, right? Cultures with these incredible histories of science, industry, democracy.
Stelping this strong streak of what she calls self-loathing,
Yeah.
a tendency to view their own past as suspect or shameful.
Exactly. She wonders why. Is it like a societal nervous breakdown, maybe linked to losing empires or the sheer effect of long-term affluence? It's a puzzle she raises.
Why this intense self-critique specifically here?
It's a really interesting question she leaves hanging.
Then she shifts gears a bit, looking at consent and sexual morality. How have things changed there, according to her?
Well, she points out the big swing from, say, the 60s and 70s mantra of get government out of the bedroom, very libertarian,
Right.
to today, where there's actually quite extensive state interest and regulation around consent, relationships, what happens behind closed doors.
That is a big shift. But she critiques the modern focus on consent alone.
She argues it's insufficient, that just focusing on did they consent doesn't capture the full ethical picture.
How so? What are the gaps?
She brings up tricky issues like AI-generated child abuse imagery or the ethics of large age gaps in relationships, even if consent is technically present. She feels our intuition often tells us there's more to morality than just consent.
So consent is necessary, but not sufficient.
That's the idea. And historically, she argues, society's always had broader norms and structures around sex, precisely because it's tied to reproduction, family, social continuity things bigger than just individual agreement.
And she thinks the decline of older institutions, like family and church, has led to the government stepping into that moral vacuum.
That's her suggestion, that as those traditional sources of moral guidance weakened, the state increasingly took on that role, perhaps inadvertently.
And she even makes a case for traditional Christian sexual ethics, not necessarily on purely religious grounds.
Right. More as a system that, historically speaking, seemed to work reasonably well for human flourishing over a long period. She contrasts that with what she sees as the less successful outcomes of the post-60s experiment. It's definitely a provocative stance.
It is. How does all this translate into her own life, like raising her kids?
Well, she talks about raising her sons, choosing single-sex schools, taking them to church,
Okay.
and generally encouraging traditionally masculine pathways while also recognizing individual variation and the need to channel male energy positively.
So not just rejecting modernity wholesale, but trying to blend tradition with awareness.
Seems like it.
Yeah.
She mentions rejecting subversion for subversion's sake, embracing some traditional virtues, but being aware of potential pitfalls too.
And there's the OnlyFans discussion. That seems like quite a different topic.
It does, but it connects to her themes of sexual morality, technology, and maybe impulsivity. She highlights some surprising statistics.
Like what?
Apparently, a very high percentage of content on OnlyFans is pornographic, and a significant number of young American women have created content on there.
Wow. Why does she think that's happening? What are the drivers?
She suggests a mix of things. Misguided ideas about sexual liberation coming from some feminist circles, maybe simple vanity, the lure of easy money, although she thinks that's often a false promise.
Right, the idea that everyone makes a fortune probably isn't true.
Exactly. And maybe just impulsiveness, not thinking through long-term consequences.
And she sees definite long-term
Oh,
risks.
yeah. Potential negative impact on finding a long-term partner, the risk of future embarrassment or reputational damage as images stay online forever.
So she argues for what? More social control.
She argues for the value of social guardrails,
Mm.
even taboos, things that discourage people from making potentially harmful choices driven by short-term desires like vanity or impulsivity. She looks back at how local communities used to enforce certain norms.
And she points out that feminists aren't united on this.
Not at all. A deep divide. Some see participation in the sex industry, like OnlyFans, as female empowerment and autonomy,
While others, like the reactionary feminists she sometimes aligns
are
with.
highly critical, seeing it as harmful and exploitative of women. Perry also adds that the fact that relatively few mothers are in top positions of power means there's still a need for feminism focused specifically on protecting women's distinct interests.
Okay. One last major topic she tackles is the fertility crisis,
Yes, this global, really quite unexpected decline in birth rates.
happening everywhere, not just in specific countries.
Pretty much everywhere, she notes. China, Japan, Italy, South Korea, maybe even Australia. Across different political systems, different economies.
And do we know why? What's causing it?
That's the big puzzle. Perry suggests affluence seems to be a major factor. Maybe being comfortable makes people less inclined to have kids. It's counterintuitive.
Yeah, you might think the opposite. She mentions the post-war baby boom.
Right. Times of hardship and scarcity sometimes seem to correlate with more babies, not fewer. So affluence being the driver is strange.
But she does note one group that tends to have more children.
Religious people. On average, more religious individuals and communities have higher fertility rates.
Which could lead to a demographic shift over time.
Potentially, yes. A future where societies become gradually more religious simply because religious people are having more children?
How does Perry relate to religion personally? She mentions being a Christian agnostic.
Yeah, an interesting term. She hopes that by raising her kids within the church, within a believing community, they might genuinely find faith themselves, sort of bypassing the cultural fire break that severed her generation, perhaps, from that tradition.
So she sees a potential for revival.
She seems hopeful. She mentions anecdotes of increased church attendance, more conversions happening in some places.
And she has this almost ironic thought that the problems caused by leaving Christianity might actually be evidence for it.
Kind of, yeah. The idea that if Christianity predicted certain negative consequences would follow from abandoning its precepts, and those consequences seem to be occurring, well, maybe that suggests the original precepts had some truth to them.
That's a fascinating turnaround. Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. The big takeaway seems to be that this UK Supreme Court ruling isn't just a legal footnote.
Definitely not. It's a really significant moment in a much wider, deeper clash about sex, gender identity, and how society understands these fundamental concepts.
Reflecting these huge ideological divides and maybe some really profound societal shifts happening underneath the surface.
Absolutely. And as we've discussed, it touches everything: law, politics, culture, public opinion, religion, technology, even down to very personal choices.
It's incredibly complex. So maybe a final thought for you listening in, given everything we've unpacked from Perry's analysis, what do you think are the most critical, maybe unexamined assumptions driving these debates about identity today?
Yeah, what are those base level beliefs we often don't even question?
And if we started questioning those assumptions, could that lead us to some fresh perspective, maybe some more nuanced understandings?
It's definitely worth thinking about. We'd encourage you to explore Louise Perry's ideas further, and of course seek out other viewpoints on these really vital, complex issues.